What is the role of intimacy in marriage? In Genesis, we read that God establishes a one flesh relationship of naked and no shame. We just spend a moment in Genesis 2. That is why God says, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and they will be one flesh. And Adam and his wife were naked and felt no shame. That naked and no shame is a relationship of total vulnerability and total trust. And Jesus in Matthew 19 pointed right back. For this reason, he said, a man will leave his mother and father and be united and be one flesh. And the Apostle Paul, talking to the marriage situation in Ephesians chapter 5, talks about that one flesh, naked, no shame. Intimacy is a state of being deeply known and loved by another person, and deeply knowing and loving that person. See, marriage is God's given place for that total intimacy. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that it's only in marriage. Non-sexual intimate friendships are possible. In fact, they are important in life. But let's concentrate on marriage for this video. Intimacy in marriage at its deepest level requires tremendous vulnerability. And you can only do that when you are in a deeply trusting relationship. So often this is what comes in the way of true intimacy in marriage. And yet, without intimacy, a couple would find it really difficult to know their full worth or experience truly authentic love and bonding. See, the problem here is that for us broken, wounded, fragile human beings, intimacy is a risk. Much as we want to be truly known, we fear rejection when we make ourselves vulnerable. And sadly, many couples believe that if they're having intercourse, this must mean that they are being intimate in all its fullness. This is not right. Sexual intimacy is only a part of intimacy, and intercourse is only a part of sexual intimacy. If you're watching this as a couple, stop and evaluate yourself in every one of these intimacy stages that we are going to be talking about. I'll talk about 6. Spiritual intimacy, recreational intimacy, intellectual intimacy, emotional intimacy, physical intimacy, and finally sexual intimacy. I bet you didn't think it was so complex. So let's start. Spiritual intimacy. It comes from being in the Word of God together, praying for one another, praying together, worshiping together, the devotions that you have as a family. The Word of God nourishes our soul. Worship together is an incredibly intimate act. See, the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 7, after talking about the bodies belonging to each other and, being authentically intimate with each other, with the whole body, then says, do not deprive each other except perhaps by mutual consent and for a time so that you may devote yourself to prayer. And then come together again so that Satan doesn't tempt you for your lack of self-control. You see, even there he says prayer is important. I like to read, it makes you even more sexually intimate. See, it's so important that we maintain that worshipping together, it is the foundation of our intimacy. Just a little proviso here. Don't make it a chore or a ritual. Make it a joyful spiritual intimacy between husband and wife and the children. Stop if you want right now, if you're watching as a couple, and assess, how is your spiritual intimacy? How can you improve it? Let's move on. Recreational intimacy. When was the last time you actually asked your spouse what he or she would enjoy doing that day? Do you know what your spouse might say? We got a free day. What would my spouse like to do? Recreational intimacy is a bond that is created by doing activities together. It may be just a crossword that you work together or a jigsaw puzzle, or else it might be quite active, like going for a walk together. It fuels your bonding. God has made us to enjoy life. God has created the whole of nature for us to enjoy. Use it. Form those bonds of intimacy. And if you're watching as a couple, stop and think, how can we improve our recreational intimacy score? Thirdly, intellectual intimacy. Hey, I'm an academic. I love intellectual intimacy. But the intellectual intimacy between husband and wife is something unique. It's the activity of connecting by discussing important issues. You know, as time passes in our marriage, we assume that we know everything that our spouse thinks on nearly every topic. And we forget to explore. We forget to talk about things. No matter how many times you talked about it, talk about it again. You might find something really exciting that your spouse knows. And you can learn something new. So if you're a couple, you might want to stop now and assess your intellectual intimacy. Let's move to the fourth one, emotional intimacy. This is probably the one that many people are uncomfortable with, because you're sharing your deepest fears and aspirations with someone else. And you're thinking, am I going to be rejected here? Is this person going to understand? Or they're going to jump to a conclusion that I'm saying something about them, and they're going to bite back and feel cornered. It's often the hardest level of intimacy. When you have been married for a while and you've nurtured children, you assume that you should be high on the emotional intimacy scale, but it's not so. If you're struggling with some issue, take time to talk and express your feelings, but do it in a positive way, rather than tearing the person down with you did this, you did that, you didn't do this. Rather say how you feel about it, how hurt you felt. Express those what we counselors would call I statements. I feel this way. And always remember, be gentle. Proverbs chapter 15 says, a gentle answer turns away wrath, but harsh words stir up anger. Look for ways of sharing positive emotions of appreciation and thanks. Let them outnumber even your negative thoughts, much less your negative words. Maybe it's time to stop and assess. Every couple can improve in this aspect of intimacy. Let's move on to the next, physical intimacy. How often do you and your spouse touch, hug, kiss in a non-sexual way? Non-sexual intimacy, a playful touch, the pat on the bottom, the peck on the cheek in the morning, the hug on returning from work, all all these send a spike of the hormone oxytocin in your brain, bonding you together, make it a part of your spouses and your couple life. Don't neglect it. Don't think that every touch must move on to sexual intimacy. Stop and assess if you want. And let's move on to sexual intimacy. Finally, sex, they go. Let's make one thing clear here. Sexual intimacy is not equal to sexual intercourse. How can you be sexually intimate without having sexual intercourse? Maybe you even want to stop and think about that now. Sexual intercourse is a part of sexual intimacy, but only a little part. What then is sexual intimacy? Maybe the better word is sensual intimacy. It is what a couple share using every one of their senses to arouse and satisfy. Touch, taste, smell, tender talk. The use of the whole body. The Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 7 says that. Share your body. He says the woman doesn't have authority. She yields her body, the whole body to her husband. Similarly, he yields his whole body. For more examples, just read the Song of Songs. Let me read a few. Pleasing is the fragrance of your perfume. He says, your name is like perfume poured out. I delight to sit in his shade, the woman says. His fruit is sweet to my taste. My beloved is mine. He browses among the lilies. Your lips drip sweetness as the honeycomb, my bride. Milk and honey are under your tongue. See, all the senses are being used there. Stop and assess. Take a few minutes. Do you know what your spouse enjoys? How does he or she like to be touched? What part of their body do they like touched? Take a few minutes and talk about it. And as we pull together, my hope and prayer is that you will find that your marriage is filled with intimacy. As a couple, seek intimacy with Jesus. That is your primary intimacy in His Word. And build intimacy with each other in a true, naked, and no shame relationship.